Thank you very much. Over the years, I've heard a recurring analogy from entrepreneurs. They've told me things like they felt like they were in the clouds, they weren't sure which way was up, there were so many things happening at once that they were losing a sense of direction, and that they felt that they needed to get their feet firmly planted back on the ground before moving forward. And what I started to think about was that, in fact, I had experienced some of those very same feelings. And it wasn't until I actually started instrument flying, and that is flying in the clouds without a visual reference to the ground, that some of this started to make sense. So one of the first things that you learn in pilot training is something called the 4 forces of flight. These are the 4 forces that affect all things that fly. And I want to do a little illustration for you. By the way, one of the best things about organizing a conference like this is that there are a few things you get to do which you wouldn't normally get to do, and one of them is writing on the wall. So let me just give you a little illustration of what I'm talking about. So the 4 forces of flight essentially work this way. There's thrust. And thrust is the force that propels a flying machine in a forward direction. And there's drag. And drag is the force that acts opposite to the direction of motion, and it's caused by friction and differences in air pressure. There's weight. And weight is the force of gravity that pulls the aircraft down to the center of the Earth. And finally, there's lift. Can I tell you how relieved I am that I didn't mess that picture up? Because it's going to be there all day. So lift is the force that directly opposes the weight of the airplane and holds it in the air. When the airplane is flying at straight and level and at a constant speed, and that's very important, the lift it produces balances its weight, and the thrust it produces balances its drag. Now, I contend that there are also 4 forces that affect a startup's ability to achieve and maintain flight. And I'll switch colors here to tell you about this. So thrust in my model is provided by capital. All right? And that capital takes multiple forms. There can be venture capital. There can be the internally generated capital from the business, from its own revenue and cash flow. And there's also human capital and intellectual capital. So we'll just sum up all the capital available to a business is what provides thrust. Now, the challenge or the drag on that business are the competition for resources. And these resources are in limited supply. All right? It's an opposing force because the competition is chasing down your customers. It is chasing down your employees every day. And depending on the business you're in, could also be chasing down limited supply of componentry that you need for your business, for example. And so these things balance themselves out. Weight is omnipresent. So just as weight is conspiring against conventional flight, the risk that an entrepreneur faces is similarly pulling that business down to the ground. And for any of you who understand the bell curve, we don't want to be right in the middle where everyone else ends up, the 9 out of 10 startups that will fail. What we're trying to achieve is to be one of the outliers at the tail. And so we have to keep in mind that that risk is omnipresent. And then that leaves us with lift, or in my model, what I'll call execution. So the lift is provided as an opposing force by the company and the team's ability to execute and to differentiate. And to do that requires a whole lot of commitment and perhaps a little bit of hubris and maybe even a little bit of ignorance, because I hear lots of entrepreneurs tell me that if they actually knew how hard it was, they wouldn't have done it in the first place. So just like in the airplane example, when your business is flying straight and level and at a constant speed, The differentiation balances its prospects for success, and the capital that it generates or has access to balances the drag from competition. Now, this is where things start to get really interesting, and we'll come back to the analogy of the founder stuck in the clouds. So we've got the little bit of lesson in the background, and let me give you some context. We all know which way is up, right? But in the clouds, things are not always as they seem to be. So we take a lot for granted living here on Earth. We're ground-based organisms. The Earth is always beneath our feet. It's very clear to us, up is up and down is down. But in visual flight, when you can see the horizon, it is our sight that helps us determine the relationship between the aircraft's attitude and the Earth's surface. But what happens without normal visual input? What happens is that the brain is left to its own devices. And when you're flying in the clouds, and you see through the windscreen that there's absolutely nothing to look at, you're forced to, and you need to, control the airplane solely by reference to instruments. Because without those normal visual cues, the body sends very unusual messages to the brain, which creates a conflict between what you see in the instruments and what the instruments are telling you and what's actually happening. And this is called spatial disorientation, and it occurs because of the mixed signals from the body's 3 sensory systems. So the whole process of instrument training is about teaching the pilot to always trust the instruments, and that's an always, always, always trust the instruments, manage and stay ahead of the workflow, and train for contingencies. And if you get into a jam, you're trained to own it, handle it, and use your knowledge, skill, and self-awareness to deal with the situation, because you don't want to be the pilot who's practicing high-speed maneuvers, who turned the controls for what seemed to be a steep ascent and flew straight into the ground, unaware that their airplane was flying upside down. So here's the lesson. Most startup founders live at high speed with no clue as to whether they're actually flying upside down or right side up until it's too late. It is inevitable that some of you at some point in time will fly upside down. It is not intrinsically difficult to do. The 4 forces will be completely messed up, but sooner or later it must come to an end, and so you need to recognize and correct for it. Entrepreneurs have an immense capacity to be optimistic and to ignore obstacles, risk, and doubt. After all, that's what makes an entrepreneur, right? But a good entrepreneur, like a good pilot, learns to fly straight, trusts the instruments, and recognize which way is up. It takes knowledge, skill, and self-awareness. And once you can maintain straight and level flight, then there's absolutely nothing stopping you from soaring higher and faster. And remember, whether you're flying an airplane or running a startup, it's all about controlling your return to the ground. And as Chuck Yeager once said, it's not the fall that kills you, it's the sudden stop. All right. So thank you very much for coming. Enjoy the great lineup of speakers today.